Diet and exercise are a big part of our daily lives, but when a woman finds out she's pregnant, how do those things change? Are there certain things that she should or shouldn't be eating or drinking? And exercise, are there certain things that she should or shouldn't be doing while pregnant? In part 2 of our 3-part series on pregnancy and baby life, we examine how to put together the proper diet and exercise plan and just how important both are to you and the baby. If you're someone who is already active in an exercise routine, whether it's lifting weights, going for a run, or taking a special class like yoga or Zumba, then you can continue to do so while pregnant, explains Dr. Susan Passarella, an OB-GYN with Hackensack Meridian Health, while also keeping an eye on what your body can handle and what's best for the baby.
We find that people that do exercise in pregnancy are healthier. They have better deliveries. They tend to recover better. When a patient is already, again, doing any of those activities, those are all fine. Running, Zumba, swimming is great when you're pregnant. It takes the extra pressure that you get just from physical activity off, and you're very weightless in the water. So that's definitely a good activity. We tend to stay away from things like contact sports such as like rugby and soccer and skiing, water skiing, skydiving, any kind of crazy stuff you want to tend to stay away from just because the chance of injuring the baby. The uterus is very protective of the baby, but again, you don't want any big high energy contact sports.
Whether or not you're active in any kind of exercise routine, it's important to pick it up without overdoing it while pregnant.
The American College of OB-GYN recommends about 150 minutes of exercise a week for a patient. And you can split that up in 30-minute increments, 5 times a week, or you can, or break it up in even smaller ones. A long time ago, they used to look at the heart rate, and they didn't want a mom's heart rate to go over about 120. And what we found is that really doesn't really make a difference. It's really what your baseline heart rate is. So again, something simple as walking, gardening, just little activities, those are beneficial to moms.
The benefits of lifting, running, stretching, doing yoga, Zumba, or gardening will help you not only during the pregnancy, but during labor and delivery.
For your first baby, you can push anywhere, for any baby, you can push anywhere from a couple of minutes to a couple of hours. A couple of hours you get up there and you're working really hard. They call it labor for a reason. It's definitely very labor intensive. And the better your heart works and the more cardiac exposure you've had during your pregnancy, the better you're going to tolerate and the less likely you are to have a long, labor pushing course. So running is definitely good. Again, anything that gets your heart rate up is going to, when you're pushing in labor, your heart rate goes up. So it's going to be similar to that, and will give you more endurance for sure. In addition to the cardio aspect, things like yoga and meditation and breathing definitely help. A long time ago, people used to use Lamaze, and that's kind of fallen out of favor, in that terminology, so to speak. But it's essentially what the labor and delivery nurses will kind of coach you with. Pregnant moms can lift, 20 to 40 pounds or so, depending on what they're used to. Of course, you don't want to ever start an exercise regimen or heavy weightlifting if you've never done it before. But what you should do is, again, always check with your doctor. But whatever you lifted at a baseline, you can continue to do that pretty safely.
Having a baby is an Olympic event. It is not easy to push a kid out. It's advocated that they exercise at least 3 to 4 times a week. Obviously, never to the point of exhaustion. But if a patient can learn how to develop their core or know how to activate their core, it makes it much easier for them when it's time to initiate pushing when having a baby. Because a lot of mommies nowadays, probably more than 2/3 of them typically end up having an epidural. So when they have an epidural, they're numb from their ribs down. So if they don't know how to push, it can be very frustrating for the patient to figure it out when they can't have any sensation or feel anything. But if a patient who used to go to the gym a lot or go to yoga or things like that, and they know how to activate their core, it's much easier for them to figure out what to do even though they can't feel what's going on.
While exercise is important during a pregnancy, having a steady and healthy diet is also a big part of the development of the baby and your overall health.
When they're pregnant needs probably on average about additional 300 calories to their diet. So it's kind of like if you space out your meals, an extra snack somewhere along the way. But it really depends what your pre-pregnancy weight is. That's really what we look at. So if you're an average weight person, we expect someone to gain probably between 25 and 35 pounds during the course of a 10-month pregnancy. Usually in the first trimester, people are nauseous and sick. They tend not to gain a ton of weight. It tends to catch up with them in that last month, where you can gain a half a pound to a pound or so a week. If you're on the overweight side, some patients, we can actually have a healthy pregnancy those that are very obese without gaining any weight at all. In fact, they may lose weight and they can still have a nice, beautiful 8-pound baby boy that comes out. Again, their body has a lot of reserves in it, and they can, have a healthy pregnancy without gaining, a ton of weight. People that are underweight, we tend to want them to gain a little bit more. So again, they may gain more in the 40-pound range, and that's okay. We never want anyone, I know everyone always says when you're pregnant you can eat for 2. That's not necessarily what we recommend, because then you have patients gaining 50, 60, 70 pounds, and those patients tend to have more complicated deliveries. They're higher at risk just in general for diabetes and hypertension. They're more likely to have C-sections. They're more likely to have babies that are really small and may not grow as well.
There are certain foods and food groups you should steer away from during a pregnancy, especially when it comes to bacteria found in what you consume.
Things we worry about is Listeria. Listeria is a bacteria that is found in dirt. We find it also in lunch meats and deli meats and stuff like that. They can be found in hot dogs. You want to make sure all your fruits and vegetables that you have, you wash very carefully. And you always want to wash your hands just in general anytime you touch any kind of meat. Meats should be cooked pretty well done when you eat them. You should stay away from sushi, sashimi, things like that, anything smoked. You can go to a Japanese restaurant and get, your sushi fix. You just have to stay away from all the raw stuff. We do recommend having at least one serving of fish a week, but you do want to have the low mercury fishes.
There are rules and regulations regarding any use of alcohol, cigarettes, caffeine, and how much water you should be drinking on a daily basis.
Again, we don't know exactly what amount of alcohol causes fetal alcohol syndrome, so we usually don't recommend any alcohol in pregnancy. Again, same thing with cigarette smoking. We know that people that smoke tend to have babies that are smaller. They're more at risk for preterm labor. It affects the placenta and growth of the baby. We don't recommend any smoking. We don't want you to drink a ton of caffeine. We don't want your baby too jittery. But 1 cup a day is appropriate. Or you can have 2 cups of tea. About 300 milligrams of caffeine a day. A patient should probably drink about 10 to 12 8-ounce glasses of water a day. They really need to make sure they're staying well hydrated, especially in the summer months. People tend to come into the OB emergency room and they're definitely on the dehydrated side, and that can increase your risk for preterm contractions.
If and when you experience heartburn during a pregnancy, Dr. Joanne Chang says that doesn't mean your child will have a lot or a little hair when they're born.
Those are some old wives' tales, but there's no studies that have shown that what you eat affects how much hair your baby has. And you'll hear anecdotally that women will say, I had so much heartburn and my baby had so much hair. But on the flip side, you'll also talk to some women who say, I had a ton of heartburn and my baby had no hair. Heartburn is very normal during pregnancy. Again, it's a part of one of the side effects of the hormone changes. And then also just from physical space, as the baby grows bigger, pushes up on everything and it makes the acid kind of reflux a little bit into your esophagus.
Sandra, a mother of 5 who gave birth to her first son earlier this year, says many of her cravings for certain foods remained the same through each of her pregnancies.
I always craved carbs and cheese. So I didn't necessarily know the difference between a boy and a girl, because those first 3 months it's like carbohydrates and cheese. And so even on the 5th one, we were like, is it really a boy? We'll make sure. I think we won't find out that it's really a boy until the day of. That's when we're really going to believe it. I craved a lot of steak and a lot of spinach salad, because my iron would always drop too. So my energy levels would go down. So with the red meat and the steak, that would definitely bring my energy levels back up.
In the final part of our series, Sandra explains more about what pregnancy is like and how to prepare for parenthood. For Town Square Media News, I'm Vin Ebenu.